right, welcome back everybody to episode 7 of our podcast, Gusts Gullywashers with Quinton and Sam, and we got a special guest today, joining us from, Oklahoma?
Yeah, down in Norman.
Nice. Welcome, Sean. Is it Waugh?
It's Waugh, actually.
Waugh, okay. I was wrong
Yeah.
then. Nice. Great to have you on. It's a thrill. It's our second guest, I guess, technically, so first one in the weather community, so it should be an honor. Not sure how many people are listening today. Would be nice to have a viewer count, but I think we're up to a few views on YouTube as of this morning, so we're slowly gaining traction.
At least one.
Yeah, at least one. So I guess, Sean, you want to introduce yourself, who you are, everything like that?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Sean Waugh. I work at the National Severe Storms Laboratory, which is a department of NOAA, and that's located in Norman, Oklahoma. So we're gearing up for spring here, although I shouldn't say here because I'm probably going to be leaving in the next 24 hours to go to probably Illinois for some severe weather over the course of the next week. But a lot of the work that I do at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory involves instrumentation. I actually design and build and usually operate a lot of the research equipment that we use on a variety of field project efforts. And that goes back all the way when I first got started as a lowly undergrad student. That was the Vortex 2 project. And I've basically been involved in some way with every major field campaign that's come out of the National Weather Center here in Oklahoma. So I've had a lot of good opportunities over the years, and it's been a lot of fun to kind of see the instrumentation and the research grow over that time.
Awesome.
Wow.
So you're going up for severe weather, and you said next week?
Yeah, so we're actually running a field campaign right now. It's called Delta, which initially was meant to play off the fact that we were primarily focusing on the Mississippi Delta region, and then our first IOP, we're naturally going to go nowhere near the Mississippi Delta. But the basic idea is to study tornadic, storms, whether that be QLCS tornadoes or supercell tornadoes or whatever. Generally speaking, in the Southeast, that's been an area of the country that we haven't really focused on in the last couple of decades, mostly because it's actually really difficult to run field projects in the Southeast because there's trees everywhere. So we haven't focused on that area as much. And, anybody that does, pay attention to severe weather or do storm chasing or research or anything like that, like you probably have noticed that storm environments in the Southeast tend to produce tornadoes a little bit differently than the ones in the Central Plains do. You don't need as high of, a parameter space in a lot of cases. Storms tend to form more at night and they move quickly.
Right.
Tsunami system, that sort of thing. So we've designed a project. The last couple of years, we've done a project called Perils, which was designed to look at specifically QLCS tornadoes. This year, we're kind of broadening that out and just looking at any sort of tornadoes. But it's been kind of quiet. And the event that is potentially setting up on Tuesday up in mostly like central to eastern Illinois has some potential. So we're actually going to have a forecast discussion later on today to kind of talk about that and see if it's something we want to pull the trigger on.
Wow. I'm surprised that they have severe weather this time of year, but it's been very anomalously warm and I guess somewhat convective too. So.
Yeah, I mean, Norman, this time last year, what is today, the 24th, I think? It was the 26th last year of February that we actually had a QLCS storm come through Norman. And the line, was mostly just like a squall line. It wasn't really doing much. But about 45 minutes west of Norman, a supercell structure more or less formed in the line itself and ended up producing a fairly strong tornado that missed my house by about 150 yards. So that was a very interesting night. So it does happen. We tell people all the time, like, tornadoes can happen any time of year.
Yep.
If the conditions are right and they're there, that's all it takes.
Now, is there a cold season tornadoes and warm season? Are those different, like, ingredients you need or, I don't know, parameters or?
Yeah, the southeast part of the U.S. would probably be more of like a cold season type event. I mean, their typical severe weather season for tornadoes is anywhere between March and maybe November to like late March, maybe April. I mean, April 27th, the Super Tuesday outbreak was, at least I think that was a Super Tuesday outbreak. I'm not one of those like tornado encyclopedia people that can just rattle off days, But, that was the southeast severe weather event. And I mean, that was in April. Now, granted, that's pretty much in spring. So that's a little bit more, classic severe weather season. But I mean, the Southeast has had some pretty significant tornado outbreaks in, November, December, January, that kind of time frame. So it's a little warmer down in the Southeast, later on into the season, and the way the synoptic patterns kind of kick through, like you can still produce severe weather. So there are differences between those, both location wise, time of year wise, that sort of thing.
So there's not really a set season. It's kind of a year-round sort of deal.
Even Norman, everybody here in Norman, like you kind of get used to it. Like, severe weather season is like March through June, and then it kind of gets hot. But then we had a tornado in February last year, and everybody was like, oh yeah, no, that can happen anytime, like especially here. So. It's something that, like, if you're in an area that has, the potential to have those types of events, if you live up at the top of Pikes Peak, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. But, for the rest of us, like, you got to pay attention year round.
Mother Nature says, hold my beer.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, that's awesome. So going back to yourself, where did you go to school for undergrad, and I guess where you born, everything like that?
Yeah, so I originally grew up in South Central Kansas, very, very small town called Arkansas City. If you look it up on the map, it's going to look like Arkansas City, but don't call it Arkansas City. It's Arkansas. It's the Arkansas River. If you're in the state of Kansas, then it's the Arkansas River outside of it. Huh. So relatively small town. I mean, I think there was like maybe 12, 13,000 people in my town.
Okay.
I mean, there are certainly towns that are smaller. I've been to towns that are smaller, but for me, like it was a pretty small town feel. And I moved down to college, so I came down to Norman to start my undergraduate degree at OU, and really fell in love with Norman. The undergraduate enrollment here is probably double the size of my hometown, so it was a bit of an adjustment, getting used to the fact that like there's like 70,000 people or 80,000 people now in town, whatever the population of Norman is. But I've really grown to love the area. And I chose to stay basically all the way through my master's and PhD at OU. So I spent a cumulative total of about 11 years at OU with a lot of student loans to show for it. So, but it was a good time. OU was, one of the preeminent like severe weather schools. And for me, like the biggest selling point was kind of that juxtaposition next to, sorry, you're probably going to hear my dogs in the background now. God forbid somebody walked by in front of my house. But to me, that juxtaposition between like having the school there, but also having like the National Severe Storms Lab and, the OUN office, like the Norman Forecast Office and the Storm Prediction Center and the Cooperative Institute, like there's so many different organizations that are in the same building. And that makes it really exciting because there's all these people that you can talk to. And that was something I just like absolutely have.
It's like the weather hub for the entire U.S. is like right there in that city.
Yeah.
Which is, I still have yet to go there. I would love to check it out. So it's like heaven, I think. all the good stuff with severe weather is like formed out of there, basically. So yeah.
And there's a lot of other good schools around the country. I mean, there's a lot of programs that have amazing meteorology programs and amazing professors that you can work with. So I always tell students, like, if you're looking for schools, like, you kind of have to look at like, what is it you want to study? Who do you want to work with? What does the environment look like? That sort of thing. So there's pros and cons to every decision, but there's a lot to offer here for sure.
Oh yeah. Never ending.
Each school kind of caters to what you want to go into. Would you say that every school around the nation kind of caters to a specific branch of research or specialty field?
Yeah,
like subfield of meteorology, would you say?
Different programs have different strengths, right? Like if you really want to study hurricanes, like maybe Florida is a better option. Although we do hurricane work out of Norman, it just involves a lot more driving than it does if you already live in Florida. Some programs focus more on climate or aerosols. Some programs focus more on severe weather or winter weather. Every program kind of has its own specialties that they tend to focus on. And it's usually relative to, the conditions that they experience, right? So it really much depends on what you think it is that you want to study. What are your interests in? What do you want to follow and things like that? And you're always welcome to change, right? Like you can go to undergrad in one place and then be like, I really want to go study tornadoes. So I'm going to go to
Right.
And then you study tornadoes for 2 years and you're like, I really don't like tornadoes. I want to go study winter weather instead. So, maybe you go to, SUNY Oswego up in New York or something like that. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of hone your knowledge base and your expertise as you go along.
So why meteorology? Why the instrumentation sector?
So there's kind of two parts to that story. Weirdly enough, if you ask most meteorologists, what got you interested in the weather, how long do you want to be a meteorologist, that sort of thing. Like, for whatever reason, most of us, it's been like a lifelong passion, right? It's like you can't ever remember a time not the weather. And I'm the same way. One of my earliest memories was actually on my grandfather's farm in north central Kansas. He had a couple of wheat fields and some livestock out in the area, and I was maybe like 4, 5 at the time, and he was pacing back and forth. The weatherman was on TV talking about, like this big hailstorm coming in, and he was obviously worried about his crop. And it ended up not happening, which is good, his crop didn't get destroyed. But he was rather annoyed at the TV meteorologist because, they said that there was going to be this big hailstorm and then it fell apart and it just rained. So he was using some fairly colorful language at the TV, I remember. And I kind of stood up and I was like, Grandpa, I'm gonna grow up someday and I'm gonna be a meteorologist and I'm gonna be right all the time. And he goes, well, you're gonna make a lot of money because you're gonna be the only one. And that just kind of stuck with me. It's something that I've always been interested in. I've always been fascinated by storms. Like I'd stand at the window and watch, severe weather outside, that sort of thing. I tried to convince my mom to let me go storm chasing in my car in high school. And I made it to the edge of town and then she was like, okay, that's enough. You can't go any further. So it's been a passion of mine forever. But interestingly enough, when I came to OU, I knew about the people on TV and I knew about the weather service. That was it. That was the extent of my knowledge of the weather community. I had no idea that we didn't already know everything about the weather. I just naively assumed that we had it all figured out, right? I mean, we're making these forecasts, like surely we must understand. Right. So then I got to OU and I was just like blown away, because there's so much of the field. I mean, we know 5% of how the atmosphere works. So I discovered the research side of things and I really started to fall in love with that. And then in my junior year, I took an instrumentation course, and that was kind of my first experience in instrumentation. And I've always been the type of person that I like to work with my hands. Something breaks, I take it apart, I try to fix it. If I can't, I throw it away, but at least I tried, build stuff in my garage, that kind of thing. So for me, instrumentation was just kind of like an add-on to that interest that I already had in my personal life. And then at the same time, I also got a hauling scholarship, which is a NOAA scholarship that comes with a 2-year, it's a 2-year program, and it comes with an internship at any NOAA facility. So I used that to actually open a door for me at the lab, where I was able to get an internship working with a group of researchers that were doing lightning-focused work, and that got my foot in the door, right? So now I'm working at the lab, working on some lightning-related things, starting to get involved with instrumentation. And I just kind of fell into a project where my boss at the time kind of handed me some mobile mesonet data from a platform that they had out in a recent field campaign. He was like, hey, make me some plots of this. And I started looking at it and I was like, this seems kind of weird. Either that or you were in a tornado for 3 hours because the wind speed's 160 miles an hour. And it turns out that the GPS on the car had broken and it wasn't reporting properly, so it wasn't backing out the vehicle motion. But when I found that, I went to the instrumentation tech that designed the platforms and I showed it to him. And he's like, this is great. He's like, I'm glad you found the problem. You're going to help me fix it. So I just kind of fell out of luck, right? And that was around the time that the Vortex 2 project was kind of starting to gear up and they needed somebody to help build the vehicles. So I just kind of fell into that. So I actually ended up designing and building all of the NSSL vehicles, excluding the radars, because I try not to deal with radars too much. But excluding those, I basically built all the vehicles that we used for the Vortex 2 project, which was a ton of fun. And because of that, if you built it, you're the one that knows how to fix it. And if it breaks, it's not going to be in Norman. It's going to be in South Dakota somewhere. So I got to go and I got to basically drive, I drove Paul Markowski and Yvette Richardson around in the Vortex 2 project, which was a ton of fun. I learned so much from them, having them in the car. It was just an incredible experience. And that was like a rocket for the rest of my career. It just took off from that point.
Wow. That's awesome. That's
that's
dream.
Pretty amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit of good timing, obviously, being in the right place in the right time. But a lot of it was just kind of once I identified oh, this is something I really, really enjoyed. I more or less made it my goal to become as involved as possible so that by the time I graduated college, in whatever capacity that was, I knew so much about the systems that they couldn't let me go and they would have to hire me. If I left, I would take all of that knowledge with me. And it worked because they gave me a job when I graduated.
So what year did you initially get the internship?
So I started college in 2005. That would have been my freshman year. And the internship, I got the summer between my sophomore and junior year. So that would have been 2007-ish, somewhere in that range. The internship is like the summer halfway through. So like the first year, you're basically just on the internship, and then you're on the program. They give you a stipend, tuition waivers, that sort of thing. And then the second, like the summer in between those 2 years, is when the internship takes place.
Okay. So you've been there for well over 10 years, 15 years?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, like I moved to Norman in 2005. And that was it. Like I basically never went home. I wanted to get out of my small town. Like I love my town, but I needed to get out. So I came down to Norman and just made that my home. So I've been here since 2005.
Wow.
Huh.
And so you got was it master's, you said?
Master's and PhD.
Oh, and PhD. That's right. You got your PhD. Because your dissertation was on the temperature. It was that aspirated shield that you created, right? I think I have it saved on my computer.
The master's project.
That was, okay. So what was your PhD thesis then?
So my dissertation work, everybody's at this point, if you're familiar with the weather, or even if you're not, like you've looked at a radar image, right? Mm-hmm. And a radar is doing a really good job of trying to tell us, in some box at some distance away, vertically in the atmosphere, what's going on, right? Like it's an average sense of the types of particles that are there. How big are they?
Right.
Rain, is it hail, that sort of thing, right? But that's a guess. Ultimately, it's a guess. We're taking a radar return and we're making some assumptions about what's in that volume, and then we're making a best guess as to what's there. In order to better inform those types of retrievals, we need to know what's actually in that volume. And that's a really challenging question to answer, because the only way that you can really do that is fly a plane, and planes fly at like 400 miles an hour. So like you're covering that box like almost instantly, right? So you got to do like these large horizontal samples, and you got to make a lot of assumptions about homogeneity, so that that there's no change in the atmosphere as you're flying along. It's not a great way to do things, because we know the atmosphere has a lot of large changes in very small spatial scales. So my dissertation was actually designing an instrument that goes on a balloon that we can put into severe weather to try to directly sample particles that are there. So like raindrops, snowflakes, hailstones, frozen grasshoppers, whatever happens to be there.
Is that tethered?
Do what?
Is it a tethered balloon, or you guys launch it like a regular weather
balloon?
No,
it's a completely free-flying balloon, so we have no control over where it goes once we let it go.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
That's part of the fun, is trying to let it go in the right spot so that it goes where you hopefully want it to go. But it's not tethered because we want it to go higher than a tethered balloon can do.
Oh, okay.
Also, we tend to launch these in, we'll say, highly electrified storms, and I have no intention of becoming Ben Franklin 2.0. So running a tethered balloon up into a supercell that's producing lightning doesn't really sound like a fun time for anybody at the ground. But the box is actually kind of unique. It's made almost entirely out of styrofoam. It's about 4 feet long, but it only weighs about 6 pounds. And there's some reasons for that. And that's because in order to stay under the FAA's Part 101 license, where like you're in the unmanned. If you go over that limit, and there's a couple of other regulations in there, but if you go over those rules, you have to have like a transponder on it. You got to get air traffic control clearance. You can't fly into clouds. Like there's all these other rules, right? We don't want to deal with that. So we just stay under the weight limit. So the instrument has, the version now has a very small camera. It's about the size of a postage stamp, actually. It's a very expensive postage stamp, but it shoots 4K footage. And what we're doing is we're basically just taking pictures of a known volume. And because we know how big the volume is, any object that's in it, we can size that object. So we can actually like get particle size distributions at altitude in places that you cannot put a plane. I mean, we're talking about active lightning regions, hail, icing conditions, that sort of thing, like areas that we don't have samples of. And it's been really incredible to kind of look at that data over the years.
Was this the one you had at SUNY Oswego a few years ago?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I remember that.
We were doing that at San Oswego's. We had a lake effect snow project that we did called Lee.
Yep.
Where we were trying to fly that into the lake effect snow bands up there with marginal success. Those bands are very narrow and very hard to hit, right? We also, because of, we were coming out of COVID, there were supply chain issues. So we had a really hard time getting a lot of the components that we needed. So we didn't have nearly as many instruments as we wanted. So we had to be really, really picky about when we launched them. But yes, same instrument.
So you can't put a disdrometer on a balloon. So is that kind of the solution? Like, so is it kind of a similar concept?
It's an interesting question, right? Because like when I was first designing this, if you think about how a camera works, like it takes a photo, and let's say you're shooting at 30 frames a second, right? So it takes a photo and then it waits until you hit that next frame, and then it takes another one. That time in between, you're not sampling anything. So there's naturally a question, how much are we missing between frames? So one of the first things that I did, if you're familiar at all with the Parsable or Parsable 2 laser display,
yes.
I actually took one of the Parsable 2 units apart.
Man.
All the electronics out.
Out,
rebuilt the whole thing into like a metal box that was about like 12 inches long. And there's a funny story associated with that, which was that when I was taking it apart, I naturally had a lot of questions. What does this pin do? What's that wire do? How can I disconnect this? So I was calling tech support like daily and asking all these really obnoxious questions. Like they knew who I was, like on a first name basis. Like I would call.
Oh man!
And they're like, "Oh, it's Sean."
Oh, this guy again.
So kind of towards the end, I was getting some of my questions answered, and the guy that I was talking to at the time was like, "Dude, what are you doing? Like, why are you've been asking technical questions for like 2 weeks? Like, what's going on?" So I told him, I'm taking this apart. I'm putting it into a self-contained box. I'm going to fly it on a balloon through a thunderstorm. He laughed at me. He actually laughed at me on the phone. And he was like, "This is impossible." He's like, "That unit weighs like 14 pounds. It takes a computer to run it. Like, no, like this won't work." And I was like, "Don't tell me no." So I sent him a picture. Actually, I emailed tech support a picture of it when I got done. And I was like, "Told you."
Man.
It's completely self-contained. It runs off CR123 batteries for about an hour, which is exactly how much time I needed it to run. Stores all the data locally on like a little breadboard computer and an SD card. It's perfectly self-contained. I later found out that was the CEO of the company that I was talking to. So his tech support team didn't let him forget it for a while. Like, dude, you got shown up by a graduate student.
Wow.
So we have flown disdrometers on balloons. The trick is that you don't want it immediately below the balloon, right?
Right.
The balloon's rather big, so like the balloon's going to like shield.
It's going to displace it.
So we've got like a really long letdown reel. It's about 100 feet of line, actually. So
wow.
Once the balloon goes up, it actually lets down the instruments so that they're like in the undisturbed area underneath the balloon, so that we get as pristine of observations as we.
So it's kind of like wake turbulence when you're going into land. It's out of that turbulent shadow.
Definitely.
So what kind of sensors do you have
on that system?
Yeah.
So the core of the system as it is now is basically just a camera.
Okay.
Because you can do disdrometers and things like that, but like the disdrometers have a really narrow like sample volume. You can't see what it is that's going through there. You're just getting observations. You're just getting like size and velocity, that sort of thing. And I really wanted to be able to see the objects, right? So we have a camera. It's basically just a machine vision camera and then an obnoxious amount of LED lights to illuminate the volume. This thing looks weird when it's going up. Like if you can see it in the sky, I guarantee you it looks like a UFO. But with that, we can count the objects, we can size them, but more importantly, like there are physical characteristics in the optics that you can look at, and you can tell the difference, right, between like a raindrop or a snowflake. A laser can't tell you that difference. It's making assumptions based off its fall speed or its size. I can actually like see those differences. I can see differences in ice density. And what I've done is I've taken those images and then developed a machine learning algorithm that basically auto classifies the images based on a training data set that I gave it.
Wow.
And it can auto pick out like, is this rain? Is this snow? Break that down into different types of snow. Is it grapple? Is it liquid water, but it's at an altitude where it's probably super cooled, things like that. Like the algorithm can basically classify all this. And the reason I developed that was because one flight through like a supercell, it's about 45 minutes from surface all the way up through the top of the cloud. Most of those flights generate between 400,000 and 600,000 particles in one flight. I can't classify all those by hand. That's a lot of effort. So I needed an algorithm to do it for me. We also have a radio sonde on there. So we have temperature, humidity, pressure, wind speed, wind direction,
Gotcha.
all that kind of stuff. So we basically have all the environmental variables that we need.
So it's probably high frame rate because you'd have to slow it down to actually see the particles.
So it's actually about 18, 19 frames per second, which is not super high.
Yeah.
The reason for that is because with the volume that we have, if we go much faster than that, it actually, like, if you think about that volume moving through space, the next frame is technically overlapping the previous frame. So you don't actually have independent samples, right? And what you get into is you start double counting or triple counting or more certain particles, and we don't want that. I want like a single ob of each particle so that I can calculate a true distribution, because otherwise I got to start getting into particle tracking stuff, and it gets really complicated with like snowflakes that you can't really track that well. So to avoid that, we actually slowed the frame rate down. But to avoid blurring, which is the bigger issue, right? Because you can have a really high resolution photo, but it be distorted because the object's moving during the frame. So the camera, and the reason why it's so expensive, has a global shutter, which means it exposes all of the pixels at once and then reads all of the pixels at once. It's not doing it line by line. If you do a rolling shutter where it does like one or two lines at a time, you get really clear images, but they're really distorted because the object's moving a lot during the frame capture. You want that. So that's how we avoid that problem.
And obviously, too, if you're going up to a supercell, you have insane updraft speeds, which probably make it even worse if you have a slower frame rate. So
yeah, and it's actually really interesting. It's a hard perspective to kind of wrap your head around, because like we see supercells all the time that have 50, 60, 70, 80 mile an hour updrafts, right? I mean, if it's producing hail that's falling at 140 miles an hour and is the size of a grapefruit, it had to be supported by something. So there's got to be that air up there somewhere, that's blocking it. Once you're in the environment, though, it's actually not that bad. Because you're moving, the balloon is free flying, right? So like the balloon has about a 5 meter per second ascent rate, but if it's in an environment that's moving at 100 miles an hour, it's moving at 105 miles an hour. So about 110, because it's a 5 meter per second rise rate. So it's actually not moving like that aggressively compared to the environment that it's in.
Okay.
It's transition periods, right? Where you run into an issue is like if the balloon part is in like 100 mile an hour updraft, but the instruments behind it aren't yet, because then they're being drugged through still air at 100 miles an hour. Those transition zones are where you gotta be careful. But once you're in the environment, it's not that bad.
And do you find these after they explode and fall?
Yeah. So we actually have to, because I mean, if you can imagine shooting 4K footage at 12 megapixel like sensor, 18 frames per second, 45-minute flight, that's like a terabyte of data.
Right.
And I can't stream that from any sort of instrument at 90,000 feet through a thunderstorm. The antenna required to do that would get me struck by lightning every single time I launched it. So it's all recorded locally. So we have to find it. I have to get it back. There's a GPS unit in there, so like we can recover the instrument, that sort of thing, so that like we can pull all the data off of it. I've never lost a tracker. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
I've lost instruments because they broke in half in mid-flight, and then I found the tracker.
Oh my gosh.
But I've never lost a tracker.
Which is the heart. It's like the black box of it, right? That's all the good information you need. So
yeah. I've designed them. I mean, they're made out of styrofoam, but you'd be surprised at how like rigid they are and how much they'll survive. Lee was actually probably the most challenging, because if you're not familiar with the upstate New York area, there's some wilderness area out there that you just can't reach. Yeah. So like if it gets into the Adirondacks, like some bear is going to find it, and that's going to be it,
Oh yeah.
I'm not going to get it back. We had one that we had to snowmobile about 14 and a half miles one way.
Holy cow.
And then hike another 1 mile off trail through like deep woods with probably 3.5 to 4 feet of snow.
Wow.
To find it in a tree and then come all the way back out. So
holy cow.
How long did that endeavor take? Probably a couple days?
that was an entire day. Like we left at like 7 a.m. and I got back at like 8 or 9 in that day.
Wow.
Oh my god.
What part of the Adirondacks was it in? Do you know?
It wasn't actually in the Adirondacks, that one, thankfully. We had a geofence cut down on them so we could remote trigger release from the balloon. So that it wouldn't go into the Adirondacks. But that one basically landed in the dead center of the Tug Hill region.
Yeah.
Which, when they get snow, that area basically just cuts down and turns into a snowmobile park. So
that's true.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's some pretty thick forest up there too. That's got some serious dense wilderness.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and those trees are not small.
No.
So we had a group of guys with us that were like certified tree climbers to help us like get them out of the tops of the trees and stuff that they inevitably landed.
That's a crazy project. That's a lot, but that would be really fun every minute of it. It's got to be that's got to be the time of your life. So
I really enjoy fieldwork for that very reason, right?
Yeah.
Like we get to see a lot of new places, meet a lot of new people, experience a lot of new things. Like I never thought when I started this job I'd be able to rent a snowmobile like for a legitimate science reason to get a piece of equipment back.
Yeah.
That's what it took. So
yeah. And yet all of these kids going to college just want to go be stuck in an office for 30 years forecasting. And I'm like, no thanks.
Yeah.
Where do I sign away from that and not up for it? So.
Right. And whenever we meet students out on fieldwork, because at this point I've made a lot of connections. So I know a lot of people at other universities and things like that. So like we try to talk with other students and things. And, we have people come through on tours and stuff all the time. And like so often now, like I'm seeing people like when I describe, what it is that I do, they're like, how do I do that? Like, how do I get your job? Like, are you hiring? Like, can I come work for you? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's really exciting to see that kind of interest. And when we run field projects, here at the lab and at OU, like we specifically use students to do those projects. Like I can't run all of the vehicles myself, right? So like we take students out in the field with us and try to expose them to that work and try to build that next generation of field scientists that's going to go out and discover new things.
Do you want to come to the Northeast Rim Conference with Quinton and I in a couple weeks? What do you got going on next weekend?
Next weekend?
It's up in Burlington.
According to the Euro, next weekend is also going to light off on severe weather, I think, in central Kansas. So we'll see how it goes.
Interesting. Yeah, you should come one of those years. It's the one conference I try to go to every year for my job at least, and I'm trying to convince kids to do field work, and there's a couple that have been like, how do I get your job? And
right.
I mean, I guess what do you have for those kids? Like what are your I don't know. What do you recommend for people that want to go on that route?
So, I mean, I think the most interest I get from people, and the question that I get asked the most are, usually students that are like looking at grad school or something like that. Or, I met with a bunch of undergraduate students at the most recent AMS conference that asked me this question. And, they were like, how do I do field work? How do I get involved? And the first step, I think, if you are a current student, if you're working, somewhere, whatever university, whatever program you're in, different universities have different, potentials for field campaigns. Now, it may not be to the level that like OU does, for example, because OU is a preeminent like research institution. There's always grants going on. There's always new projects in various aspects of things, right? The smaller schools maybe don't have as many opportunities, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. So, reach out to professors, anybody that's got an interest, that aligns with what your interests are, and see if there's anything like coming up, if there's anything that they are thinking about doing, and maybe they just don't know if anybody else is interested. Like you'd be surprised how far a simple conversation and that kind of thing can go. And it doesn't have to be big, right? I mean, we're not talking that it has to be a $10 million like tornado research project like, Taurus or Vortex 2. It can be something small to just, get out in the field and try a few things. Once you start looking at things like grad school, if that's in the cards, for where you want to go, like look at different programs, like what areas have research opportunities that match what your interests are. Talk to professors like, hey, do you have any funding coming up? Are there projects coming up? I tell people all the time, like, hey, if you want to study severe weather, like here's a list of schools that at least I know that have severe weather programs and professors that I know that do that. So you can kind of shop around a little bit and kind of find something that fits your needs. And ultimately, like if you're not, like if grad school's not in the cards, or you're at a research institution, a university that doesn't do a whole lot of field program research, you can do it on your own. There's nothing to stop you from, building your own, surface station and slapping it on your car and, taking observations and doing it yourself, right? There's ways to do that better than others, try to do it that way, but you can kind of make it yourself if you're determined to get out into the field and kind of experience that side of things.
Nice. It's a good way to put it. I know Quinton, he's building his own ASOS station right now, right? Tell him about that.
Oh man, way to
putting you on the spot.
spot.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's been a labor of love, a lifelong thing. I don't even. What do you want to know? I don't know what to talk about. I don't know.
Well, the specs of it, like what you're doing, your progress.
Oh, well, it's
what it's all about.
Okay. Dual anemometer, mechanical, ultrasonic heated, 3 transducer. But it's an ASOS, right? It's gonna be up on one of my buddy's properties, about northwest an hour of here, some farm. Why? I don't know, because I felt like it.
Yeah.
Why not?
Quinton and I have had a lot of conversations on Twitter.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to call it Twitter? Do I have to call it now? Yeah, I'm not calling
the Bird app.
Yeah. We've had a lot of conversations, about instruments. What do you think about this? Like, can I do that? Like, what's the best option here? That sort of thing. And, at the end of the day, like it is a labor of love, right? Like it's something that like you're passionate about, that you want to do for your own reason. You don't necessarily need any other justification for it. It's just something that you like to do. But I do think that gives you a unique advantage, because since you built it, you understand the limitations of it. You know what it can do, what it can't do, where it works, where it doesn't work.
Right.
You pay more attention to the data. And I caution people a lot on that. Like we go out on these big research projects and we collect data with mobile measurements, right? And a good aspect of my job is making sure that works properly. I've got a temperature sensor on one of the vehicles that I have that I need to look at, because it currently says it's negative 81. And I don't think it's that cold. So clearly something's not working, right? But, and obvious problems like that, sure, like those are easy to fix. It's the non-obvious problems that aren't actually problems that you got to be aware of. Like we've had people driving behind semi trucks for extended periods of time. And if I just hand that data set to somebody, they're going to be like, wow, like this vehicle was 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the environment. Like there must be some weird thermodynamic boundary that was sitting right along. And I'm like, no, it's just behind the truck. Like, So you gotta know, like, what can it do? Right. And where do I have to draw the line between like, this is a sampling issue versus this is an actual like meteorological feature. And that's really hard for people to understand a lot of times.
Yeah. But
the least understood field.
Yeah. But most people are perfectly happy with just being handed a data set. They maybe want to go collect it, but like a lot of people just do not want to try to
the
put
nuance,
time and effort to like develop it. Right. I always tell people it's really easy to make an observation. It's actually really easy. It's really difficult to make an observation that means what you want it to mean. That's the challenging part.
That's deep.
So going on that, what is it? What are your opinions on the PWS stations? Like Accurator, Davis, and
oh boy.
So I actually, interestingly enough, I had a conversation with the company that owns the Davis like group, the line, because they own like 5 or 6 different things.
Oh.
And my conversation with them at AMS was very focused on weather stations that I see like storm chasers use a lot, because that's a really easy thing to do because it does everything, right? Like I'm just going to buy this. I can't remember how much it is, $200, $300, whatever. It's relatively affordable. And I'm going to slap it on my car and I'm going to take observations. Great, right? Now it doesn't have a GPS in it. So If you're not sitting still, it's not deriving anything even remotely close to what the true winds are. And I actually asked them about that. I was like, how difficult would it be to put one in there? And they're like, well, the first guy I talked to was like, well, it's a limited market. Is that something we really want to do? But then somebody else came over and he's like, well, but it's actually not, because like, sure, storm chasers might be a little bit limited market, but like people put these on boats, out over the open ocean.
Like geolocation data for that is always useful.
Exactly, right? So there's interest there in conversations like that. At the end of the day, and I try to be clear about this kind of stuff with people, because like, especially in the storm chasing community, like you see a bunch of people that have varying levels of things on their vehicle, from, a simple $20 Amazon cup anemometer that's, 2 inches off the line of the car, to the $15,000 rack that I have sitting on top of the F-350s that I drive at work, right? There's a large degree of spread in between those. At the end of the day, it comes down to what you want out of it, right? If you just want to have it on your car because you think it looks cool, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? You don't need to hide that.
Right.
It's perfectly fine. If you're trying to collect just generic data that says roughly where it is, I don't care if it's down to 0.0001 degrees Celsius accuracy. Like, I just want to know ballparks. That's fine too. If you want research quality, okay, now you got to start answering some other questions. There's, things you got to start paying attention to, that sort of thing. So it just depends on what you want.
Right.
The Davis, the all-in-one sensors that different companies have, there's positives and negatives to all of them. A lot of those are designed to be stationary. They're designed to work in, we'll say, quiescent conditions, right? Like non-severe weather conditions. They usually don't have the fastest response time because they're not meant to, because the conditions aren't changing that rapidly, right? So they're good at, giving you a generic sense. Would I stick it on top of my, lab vehicle and use it for a research project? Yeah,
absolutely.
Now, what do you have? Do you have any personal stations at your house or in your cars that you've built or stuff like that?
Currently, no. Back in grad school, I actually built my own small pie plate radiation shield, and then I actually made my own temperature sensor, coated it in epoxy myself, put the wires on it,
Wow.
just hand built my own sensor.
Huh.
It worked reasonably well. The pie plate radiation shields are notoriously bad, especially during rain, because water just goes right through the sides of it and everything like that. And I knew that going into it, but it was just kind of fun. It was something that I did. The most that I have right now at my house, I need to get a weather station and put it up in the backyard. I don't currently have one, but I did find a weather API app that a guy in Australia actually built, and I've coded it for Norman. So it uses temperature and forecast data and radar data from Tomorrow.io. It's got some geolocation information from Mapbox and a few other places. But basically it's a flat screen attached to a Raspberry Pi that basically gives me a live weather station readout, as well as current radar, and then a 1 day, 5 day forecast.
Wow.
And I literally cut a hole in my wall closet, and it's inset in
no way.
Just this flat panel. It's super cool, but it runs 24/7.
Yeah.
Right. So you get up in the morning, you're going to the closet to get dressed, and you're is it hot or cold outside? Because despite me having 3 degrees in meteorology, I very rarely know what the temperature is going to be like on a given day.
Yeah.
So I just go in there and just tap that awake because it's always on. Just pop the screen up and boom, there's the forecast for the day. Here's what the next couple of days is going to bring. Here's what the radar looks like. That's probably the closest thing I have at my house.
No Amazon Alexa that you ask every day, what's the forecast?
No, recently she started telling me, just unannounced, has been it's gonna rain here in 3 hours, and I'm I know that, I'm looking at radar, that's fine. I don't have too much of a complicated setup. I used to in grad school when I chased a lot. I ripped the center console out of my car, and I had inverters and laptop stands and all kinds of stuff. But honestly, the way it's gotten more recently, you can do all of that on your phone.
Yeah.
You can take better pictures on your phone than half the digital cameras that are out there, DSLRs.
Right.
So it's really simplified my life a lot. When I go storm chasing and stuff on my own dime, pretty much don't take anything. Like I'll take my camera, and half the time I don't even take it out of the bag. I just got my phone out.
Wow.
Huh.
It's an easier way to chase.
It is, yeah.
It's much more enjoyable than trying to move laptops around and, that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, you almost need like 2 or 3 people for a chase, one to drive, the other one to, find where you're going, and another one to collect the data. It's like you needed some multi-step, because you can't, if you're just driving and doing all this stuff at once, you're going to crash.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
It's
and
dangerous.
when we do field projects at the lab, like, obviously we've got a really complex setup. To accomplish that goal, like we specifically say that, like, okay, you're driving, that's it. That's all you do. You're running the mesonet ops. That's all you do. Like your situational awareness, that's what you're here for. Like we task things out so that everybody's got a job, and we keep everybody safe, because that's our primary goal.
Yeah. And you only have maybe seconds or minutes to change where you're going, when you're out there. So did you guys get the notification too? It said your call ends in 15 minutes.
I did.
I guess you have to pay now for all this crap,
We'll just hang up and start over.
All right. It's $9.99 a month, of course. They want their money.
It's lame.
Like Google doesn't have enough already. Come on.
Right.
Well, should we just end it and then start it over again? Because I don't want it to like end mid conversation and then.
Yeah, that'd be kind of awkward.
All right, so I guess I'll end it and try this again, right?
Okay.
We don't have a budget yet, so we can't afford.
This is how we beat the system.
Yeah, man, we're gonna have to start a GoFundMe. Like we need money for this. I didn't realize you have to pay for stuff now. Like
it's surprising how many things that we take for granted like that, because like you don't use it like enough, on a normal day-to-day life, and then you start getting into it and you're like, oh wait, this actually costs, and it adds up. Like
it does. And everything's a monthly subscription now. It's like, BMW with a sunroof, you have to pay monthly to use your sunroof. And now I even saw that Ford's looking at getting a patent to repossess their cars that people don't pay on.
What?
And they would drive back to a secure location, and they would turn off features or make annoying sounds, so people would be like forced to pay their car. It's like, what?
Yeah, it's been a few years since I saw this come out, but a while back there was a court case actually where John Deere was fighting a group of farmers, because the farmers basically hacked into the system to allow them to do, it was something stupid. It was like playing music or something like that. But a lot of these farmers, and I say this because like my grandfather was one, they want to do all the maintenance themselves, right? Like they know how to do it. They don't want to have to tow their tractor,
they have every
God
right
knows
to.
how far, to a dealership to have somebody work on it for $150 an hour.
Yep.
And John Deere lost it. Like they were like, no, like this can't happen. And they started a case that was actually, their argument was that even though you purchased the tractor, they were trying to make the case that you didn't actually own the tractor, that the tractor was still John Deere's property. You were essentially just paying a bulk sum of a lease agreement, and that they had proprietary rights to everything involved in the tractor.
Wow.
And I think they actually lost, but a lot of the automaker companies were sitting back like, where does this go? Because that would have been the next step, is like, you don't actually own your car. So like you can't make modifications to it without authorization from like Ford or whatever. And I'm just like nervously sweating, looking at all the stuff I do at the lab going, that's not good. Like I'm not gonna be able to do this.
And I think that applies to like Lamborghinis and Ferraris. Like they own the car, and you're just like, renting it. And it's like, they have to do everything. You can't take it to, Jiffy Lube to get an oil change. Well,
granted, if I owned a Lamborghini, I think I would let them do everything to it, because I wouldn't want to ruin it. But
there was I was talking to my, I'm good friends with our mechanics where I take my Subaru, and she said that they had a customer take his 2016 WRX to Valvoline for an oil change, and they put 1.5 quarts of oil over the limit. Ooh. And I guess nothing happened, thankfully, but it could have caused the oil pressure to like go through the roof and start blowing off the gaskets. And I mean, you're talking a $10,000 engine job right there. So but subscriptions based, and BMW with you got to pay per month to get heated seats or whatever. It's like, when does it end? I mean,
it'll end when people stop paying for it. That's when it'll end.
Yeah,
so.
It's terrible,
man. Yeah.
Where was I going to go off of that? I forget. I lost my train of thought there. But back to where were we at? Talking about mobile mesonettes and all that stuff. So, yeah. What's? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was talking to Campbell Scientific a few days ago, and I've got a Sierra 2000X, and I called them to be like, hey, will this work with this logger? And they're like, it should. And then the guy, I explained like why I needed two sensors to measure temperature and dew point. And he's like, oh, that's really interesting. I've never really thought about that.
Yeah.
You're the guy. You're like the tech support guy there.
I've seen that a lot over the years. And I mean, there's still a lot of like research scientists that remain to be convinced why we need dual sensors. Like, this one says it produces temperature and humidity. Why is that a problem? It's like, well, you have to understand how it's producing the data, right? Because data looks right, but it's not. And I shouldn't say that it's not right. It's just that it's not what you think it is. Like it's very
representative of what you want it to be.
Yeah, it's really doing a good job at measuring the temperature and humidity inside that little bubble. It's just that little bubble doesn't measure, or it doesn't mean what the environment is meaning, right? So you got to really understand what's going on with things. And I see that a lot, and I try to correct it as much as I can without being too obnoxious about like, oh, here's this guy jumping on his soapbox again, that kind of thing. And I mean, it's a decision that some people have to make. Like if you're putting up a stationary tower and you've got like power requirements or budget issues, things like that. I mean, adding another sensor, like you're adding another sensor arm, you're adding another temperature shield. The sensor itself might cost, a couple $100 or, $1,000, depending on what it is that you're going to get. So like, I get it in some cases, but if that's the way that you're going to go, which is fine, like you have to know the limitations. You have to understand that like, this isn't going to sample changes in the environment, like from a temperature and humidity standpoint, rapidly. It's just not. So, you have to know where to draw the line at.
Right.
So, I guess for the mobile mesonettes, how do you sample, I guess, temperature and humidity there? Because obviously you're moving and you have condensation occurring on the sensor and stuff and all that.
So we have a temperature shield, which is the one that I designed for my master's research project. It's called the U-tube, which I tell everybody from the state of Texas looks like an upside down Longhorn symbol.
Man,
it looks like Home Depot just exploded on top of the car, right? Because it's entirely made out of like PVC and polycarbonate, and there's a reason for that. Because if it breaks, I can go buy those components anywhere, find a Lowe's, a Home Depot, an Ace Hardware, whatever other hardware stores there are. I can fix that in the field no matter where I am if I don't have enough parts, right? So that was sort of intentional. I also don't have my own like plastic molding kit like, Gill or RM Young or Campbell does. So I can't like mold my own plastic at home. I can 3D print it, sure. That would probably work for a majority of the time, but the first time that thing got hit by a softball-sized hailstone, it's going to shatter. The nice thing about PVC and polycarbonate is that thing's almost bullet resistant. Like polycarbonate's bullet resistant because it's 1/4-inch polycarbonate. That's bullet resistant to like 9 millimeter. So if somebody tries to shoot at my temperature sensor, I'll be okay. The shield is designed to accommodate both sensors that we have, with the idea that Quinton was mentioning, which is that we need a second, faster responding temperature sensor so that we can observe the actual temperature changes in the environment. And then we have a combination temperature and humidity sensor that really is just there for dew point, because it's measuring the temperature and the humidity inside this like membrane that's protecting the RH sensor, right? Because the RH sensor gets dirty. Aerosols, dirt, particles that are in the atmosphere, it attaches to the RH chip, and then it doesn't measure water vapor as well.
We know what happened to the ASOS dew point.
Right. When you watch your bias just drop like 10% a year, and then like 3-4 years down, it's like 50% off, that kind of thing.
Sheesh.
We don't want that. So that's why the membrane's there, but the membrane slows down the temperature change because air has a hard time, like it just doesn't stream through it, right? So it's more of like a convective, conductive type process to make that temperature change feed all the way through into that like internal volume. And RH is a function of temperature. So the RH inside that volume is not the same RH that is outside the volume, but the dew point is, because dew point's conserved across that. If it's not, you end up with a vapor pressure difference and it forces air through. So dew point is conserved. So really we need to think about dew point. Is the dew point accurate on that sensor? Yes. Okay, we're going to take dew point, and then we're going to take our fast temperature sensor and we're going to rederive the RH that's the environmental RH. And it will be a much faster responding RH than the RH you were going to get from that sensor. And this practice has been around for like 30 years, but it's been around from a mobile standpoint. Like we've done this at the lab, but I haven't seen as many other partners do it. The Oklahoma Mesonet does. But a lot of that's probably because they're in the same building that we are, and they were involved in the initial work that discovered that was how we should be doing things. So they were very aware of it, and they implemented that into their stations. That's one of the reasons why they're considered the standard for a lot of places on how to like model a surface observing network.
I have to ask. So I know because I'm religiously following ASOS, I've got the HMT, the dual probe dew point temperature. That probe's warmed at or above 95% humidity. The Vaisala makes the HMP 155s in a heated variant. Have you ever explored that?
I've not, actually. Are they heating it continuously?
No, it's only near or at condensing environment.
Interesting. I'd have to explore. Honestly, I didn't even know they had that sensor out, mostly because I haven't had a reason to use it. So I haven't really explored why they have it. But that's an interesting way to approach the condensing problem.
Well, yeah, because dew point is temperature independent, you don't have to worry about the temperature because it's warmed.
Right.
So it removes the condensation on it, so it responds quickly or quicker.
Are they heating both sensors?
No. So I wish I had my camera. I could show you. Oh, you know what? Hold on. We can do this. We can present. All right. So it's the Sumatra PDF, shout out.
While you're finding that, it's interesting that companies are doing that, right? Because if you think back to the Radioson system that Vaisala has, the RS-92, which was recently retired, but that was the one that they've been using for a while, had two RH sensors on it and then a temperature sensor, right? And they would alternate heating the RH sensors. Now, they were doing that because they assumed in the lower boundary layer, because that's where a lot of our like aerosols and particulate matter type stuff is, that as it was ascending, it would accumulate some of that and it would cause like a shifting bias line as the sensor went up. So what they would do is they would heat one sensor and they would take observations off the other one. And then every 10 seconds, they would flip. So then it would use the other one while heating the first one, right? And the idea was that the heating would essentially bake off like any contaminants that were on the RH chip. But they had to let it cool back down to ambient because they're not measuring the temperature of the RH chip itself. So they had to assume that it was at the same temperature that the temperature sensor was. So they would heat it and then they would turn the heating off, let it cool back down, and then they would swap and then do the other one. And they would do this every 10 seconds.
So would you get data from both sensors or just one that would just average them out or something?
So the column, if you look at the raw data, you'd have two columns, one for each sensor. And then like one would be giving you numbers and the other one would literally just say like 999. And then every 10 seconds they'd switch back and forth. Yeah.
Huh. So you've got your membrane filter with your dew point I believe you take that cap off, there's a little heating element on that, I believe, if not in the actual casing itself, or both. And then you've got the external, just it's a PRT, just pretty standard.
Right.
So
they're driving up the temperature to essentially reduce the RH of the volume so that they can still measure it without condensation, with the assumption that dew point is unchanged.
I would assume so.
Interesting.
Would you only use these for mobile applications, or like for, surface obs, like a mesonet, or?
So obviously everything that I do is attached to a vehicle for the most part, or a balloon. So yeah, I use the HMP 155s in the mobile mesonets. I'm not sure what the Oklahoma mesonet is currently using on their stationary sensors, or their stations, for their TNRH sensors. I thought it was the HMPs.
Youngs.
Do what?
I think it's the Youngs.
It might be. They've swapped recently, and I haven't kept up with what they swapped to. So they really critically evaluate things. I mean, they do a tremendous amount of testing before they put them out on the live network. So these things are used in different cases, and how you handle specific problems like that is actually really interesting. A lot of places, like if the RH goes over 100%, they just clip it off. They just assume, there's some issue with the RH, so they stop at 100. I've seen some cases where the dew point usually happens in freezing conditions, right? Because like the mesonet, for example, has 2 different temperature sensors. And let's say one of those is encased in ice and the other one's not. You can actually end up in a case where your dew point is higher than your temperature, because one of the sensors is
I've had that happen.
Right? Mm-hmm. And the natural reaction is to go, well, that can't happen. The dew point must be wrong. So they drop the dew point down to the temperature. And it's like, that's not probably the right way to do that. You really have to know what's going on, and really be paying attention to how your QC processes are working behind the scenes to know, like, okay, is this actually the right call, or should we be doing the opposite?
Didn't even think of that. Yeah.
The Oklahoma mesonet does use the 155s.
Yeah.
Okay. And those have because we use them at the New York State mesonet, and I know those have a crazy, above not like 95% humidity, the accuracy goes way down.
Yeah.
Or I guess, yeah.
It gets really hard to start measuring water vapor when you have actual water on the sensor, right? Because like you get big droplets on there, and it starts coating the transducer, and it just doesn't. Right. It doesn't work the same way.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, most people don't really care a whole lot. Like once it's above about 95%, it's A, miserable outside, and B, it's just humid. Like you're basically in cloud at that point. So depends on how accurate you want to be.
I guess that's where the warmed probe approach comes.
Right.
Because,
assuming that's what they're doing, right? Like if you heated the membrane, so the volume inside that membrane is, pick a number, 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, right? Because the environment in there is warmer, the relative humidity is going to go down. So it's going to get further away from condensation because it's hotter at the same dew point, right?
Right.
So you can artificially change the volume characteristics without actually changing the dew point. So you're avoiding condensation on the RH chip, but you're still sampling dew point. But you have to know what the environmental temperature is in there. So you have to have a really good temperature reading on how much heat you're applying in there.
Gotcha.
Gosh, that's crazy. That's crazy to think about. I never put that much thought into it. I'm just like, oh, it warms it. It's good because it won't condense,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's assuming that's what they're doing. That's probably why it's working, right? Is you make the assumption that dew point isn't going to change, because it's not like you're forcing more or less water vapor out of the atmosphere. You're just changing the relative.
Just modifying the amount it can hold.
Right.
Hmm. So then what if you got rid of that membrane and just had a RH probe in there instead of
Then
a
you
combo?
would destroy it very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, if you took the membrane away, the temperature sensor would get a whole lot more accurate because it's not a bad sensor itself. It's just that it's behind a giant membrane.
Right.
So the temperature reading would get way more accurate, but your RH sensor is just going to start like degrading almost instantly. Every molecule that hits it that's not water vapor, carbon, dirt, any sort of aerosol that's in the air, it hits that and it doesn't let go, so it just starts blocking it. And at some point you start losing sensitivity, so you start developing like a low bias, and they can get really bad really fast depending on where your conditions are.
Gotcha. So that's why I guess if you're driving, you probably need it to be like double protected. That's why it's in the tube. And
yeah, so the ones that we have while we're driving around, like obviously it's still got the membrane around the sensor.
Yeah.
I know that, and I know it's going to be slow. That's why we have the fast responding sensor. But the U-tube itself is also somewhat protected because it makes the air go vertically. So it like separates out a lot of like water that's in the air. Snow still tends to make its way up there, but at that point it's basically 100% humidity anyway.
Yeah.
But most of the like your big raindrops and things, like they get mechanically separated out.
Okay.
So it's got to go up through this tube, and there's still some aerosols in there. So like basically every field project that we have, like both before and after the field project, I actually pull all of the sensors. I have all of them calibrated again, make sure that there's no issues with them, that they don't have like a new bias that I didn't know about. And I either clean or entirely replace the membranes on those because they do get dirty.
Yeah.
And you can kind of clean them, but then at some point, like they just start deteriorating because you've been too abrasive with them. So they're not expensive. They're like $5 or $10. Like, just buy a bunch of them and just replace them every 6 months.
Right.
It's like changing your air filter in your house, right? Like you wouldn't want to just take your air filter down and
clean it,
blow it out outside, and then put it right back in. I mean, you could, I suppose, but I wouldn't.
Yeah. So what temperature sensors and RH sensors are you using in the tubes?
So the H&P 155 is what we have for the combination T and RH. So essentially that's giving us dew point. And then for our fast temperature sensor, I'm using Campbell Scientific's T109 probe. It's a stainless steel like soil temperature probe.
That's the skinny one, right?
Yeah. They're pretty hardened. And I picked that one specifically because it's got a decently fast response time. It's like 18 seconds. Which, I mean, you can get faster responding ones, sure. But then you start having other issues, like they break a little easier. They're a little more exposed. Like they get water vapor on them, and then they start getting colder than they should. There's other problems with that. But that one it's encased in like a stainless steel housing, so it's pretty robust. It is in a U-tube, so it is protected, but like it still gets beat up pretty good.
Yeah.
So we don't want issues and things like that, and we've had good luck with it over the years.
Now, what's the difference, I guess, in conductivity between stainless steel and like the platinum tipped ones that RM Young makes?
Yeah, so a lot of the platinum tipped ones, I mean, the kind of the sensing element itself is just a little bit more exposed. The stainless steel characteristics, like obviously like any metal is going to have different thermo characteristics, like how well it conducts heat across things. And that's sort of baked into the response time of the sensor itself. Most of these manufacturers do a good bit of testing, usually in like an oil bath, not necessarily air, which is why I always tell people, like, if you're building a system, like knowing the specs on the equipment is good, but that's not necessarily like the environment that you're putting it in, right? So like you should do your own testing, like do some testing with it with no airflow, do some testing with it at like 10 meter per second airflow or 30 meter per second airflow, see what that range is to see how fast it responds. Because you'd be shocked at how slow some sensors actually are compared to their specifications, because the specifications are in stirred oil, and then you're putting it in 1 meter per second air. There's a very big difference.
So what's up with the oil though? Like, why would you put it in oil when most people are going to be putting it in air? Like, why would you give them those false information, I guess?
It's kind of a standardization thing. It's easier to keep an oil bath uniform and consistent at the same temperature than it is air. first off.
Okay.
And it's just been something that they've done over the years. So like just to keep with previous tests and things like that, like they just kind of keep it going forward.
Okay.
More recently, I have seen companies that are specifying a time constant in air as well. They're putting it in a wind tunnel or a thermo chamber or something like that, to get those characteristics. So like they're getting better about it. Back in the day, they were all like just stirred oil, like all the way around. It was so annoying.
Wow.
Interesting.
And is your setup, I think it's aspirated when it's not moving, correct? Because the air is naturally aspirating it.
Yeah, so the U-tube has a fan. So if we're not moving, or even if we are moving, I've seen cases, we had a case in Vortex 2, we were driving down the highway in Nebraska, and we were, I-80, it's an 80 mile an hour speed limit. And I watched the anemometer on the vehicle in front of me completely stop moving and just start like listing around. Like, I mean, it was just
wow.
Drifting. And it's because we were driving we're driving with a tailwind that for a brief moment matched the forward speed of the car. So there was essentially zero relative airflow over the top of the car. So like the prop like literally stopped moving while the car was doing 80 miles an hour down the highway.
That's got to be freaky.
It was a little weird. Yeah.
That's crazy.
It only happened briefly and then it kept going again, right?
It's the same principle. Like if a plane is going the ground speed is the speed itself of the wind, right? It's like the same principle, I think.
Where it just doesn't move. Microbursts start to become a problem, right? Because like if you're not flying fast enough, like you get into a microburst, it's now got a tailwind.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like as you enter a microburst, you're usually like you've got a headwind, right? You throttle up because it's slowing the plane down. Then you start to see that wind speed change and you start to throttle back and you don't realize that the wind's changing direction. And at some point you now have zero relative airflow and the plane just drops.
Yeah.
Because you're not moving relative to the environment. What you really need to do is just keep going. Like you need to throttle up, right? And we've gotten a lot better about predicting that kind of thing, thankfully.
Wow.
But the U-tube does have a fan in it so that it aspirates it whether we're sitting still or even if we are moving and the relative airflow isn't high enough. But the way the plates are designed, specifically on the exhaust, there's a curved plate over a flat plate. And what that does is it kind of forces the air to like compress as it goes through that, which forces a low pressure center to develop. So as we drive down the road or as more or less the wind speed over the vehicle increases, we start to generate a stronger like pressure difference between the exhaust and the intake, and it actually starts pulling air through. So the faster you drive, the faster it samples, which is
it's a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're doing 20 miles an hour down the highway, like it's going to have a certain aspiration rate. If you're doing 60 miles an hour down the highway, it's going to have a much stronger aspiration rate. And we want that because like the faster you're moving down the highway, you're moving through that environment faster. I want to mix that environment in faster because otherwise like I'm essentially adding spatial distance to my samples as we're driving down the road and we're taking observations.
Wow. Now, I have a mobile mesonet that I have. It's called a Meteor Tracker. I don't know if you've heard of them. Mm-hmm. They're magnetic, and it's great for the car because, like you said, it's using the speed of the vehicle to aspirate it. And I've been using it for hiking actually, and creating somewhat relatively inaccurate in situ soundings up in the Adirondacks. Granted, it's taking 2-3 hours to ascend, but because the air is probably warming and stuff, but I notice when I stop, you can actually see the temperature start to go up, and then when I start moving again, even though I'm going 3 miles an hour, you can see it. So you can see these little blips when I stop, it just spikes up a little bit. But I'm like, how accurate is this? It's sitting right on my backpack right next to me while I'm moving. And I'm like, it's probably getting heat off of me. Plus, you get a good gust of wind that comes in, it'll, decrease the temperature a little bit. So I'm like, how accurate is this? But it's all relative to the environment it's in, I guess,
exactly.
Which is correct.
I've seen a lot of presentations, especially at like some of the AMS conferences over the last 5 to 10 years. This idea of something called like a network of networks, or more or less like leveraging surface observations that vehicles have inherently baked into them, right? Because most vehicles nowadays have some kind of a temperature sensor in the vehicle somewhere.
And a pressure sensor too, I think.
Pressure sensors. Cliff Mass has been doing a lot of work recently with doing pressure observations off of smartphones and things like that. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't have its merits. It does, and it's really interesting work. And some of the work that I saw him present at AMS this last time was actually pretty unique. But you have to take into consideration like what's going on with the platform itself, right? Like if I take my cell phone and I go into the weather center, which is an air-conditioned, climate-controlled environment, that's got a pressure difference. Because it has to, because that's how air conditioners work. If I get in an elevator and I go up 12 stories in a high-rise like apartment building, like that pressure is changing, right? And you have to take that into account. So how do you deal with things like that? If you've got a temperature sensor in a vehicle and you come to a stop, like I've seen some cars that just because you're stopped, like where it is, it's getting its own engine heat. I've had the temperature sensor in my car go up to like 130 degrees.
Oh yeah.
When it should have only been like 70.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And it's just because it's seeing engine heat and things like that. So like you can do things like that, but you've got to understand like, okay, well, where does this thing start having problems? And to me, like personally, I don't remove data because it's not that the data is wrong. Your interpretation of the data is what's incorrect, right? Like if my temperature sensor goes up to 130 degrees in my car because I'm sitting still, that's what it's actually sensing. It's sensing a 130 degree environment. It's just that it's not the environment's temperature that I think it is, right? That's the car's temperature environment. So I don't usually remove data. I flag it. So I'll put QC flags on things that just says like, hey, like this is questionable. You should really pay attention to what's going on here before you use this data record,
right?
For whatever reason, and then let people make their own decision.
Yeah, and we do that too. We have we get we use the Armyoung aspirated shields, and we get the readings off of that, the RPMs in real time. So if we notice the fan drops out or if it gets clogged in the summertime and it drops down, then it automatically flags out the temperature data regardless, because it's not being aspirated or the fan itself is not spinning fast enough to provide an accurate representation. So we flag it out on the website, and it won't even show up just because the fan's not working. And it's still probably relatively accurate because those are great probes. But yeah, so you said you got a few minutes?
Yeah, I got a few minutes. We actually have a forecast briefing today.
Okay.
At noon to decide whether we're going to drive all the way to Illinois next week.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up in a minute or two. Obviously, we'd love to have you back on again, and maybe for a 4-hour plus discussion. We could probably keep going all day. I know Quinton probably has a million questions. So, yeah. I guess you have any plans coming up here in the Northeast, or I guess maybe even anywhere else in the country?
We're talking about doing another Lee type project at some point. We had some leftover materials, so I need to experience lake effect snow again.
Ooh.
Like I said, I grew up in Kansas. Before the Lee project, the most snow I think I'd ever seen at once was like maybe like 6 inches. And then the first event that we worked that year was the Watertown event, where it dumped like 4.5 feet of snow.
Yep.
Wow.
I've never seen that much snow in my life, so it was very entertaining. And it's an exciting challenge because like we were specifically looking at lightning in lake effect snow bands and how that interacts with like the wind turbines up there and things like that. So
crazy good results from that.
Yeah,
really good promising results.
So I do think we'll make it back up to the New York region at some point for sure.
Awesome. Let me know. And what else was I going to say? Any conferences, or do you probably just go to AMS, or?
It kind of depends on the year. I try to go to AMS. It's a good generic conference that a lot of different people are at. It's a good opportunity to connect with students and people that have questions and network with people. AMS next year's in New Orleans, so I'm definitely going to that. Right. I also tend to go to the Severe Local Storms Conference a lot, just because it's a little bit more focused on severe weather stuff. Next year, where is it? Virginia Beach, I think, is in Virginia Beach this year.
Okay.
Both of those, I'm probably going to be presenting work from the new hail camera system that we're developing, and I'll probably have some exciting results to show on that one. And then some of the years, like there's international conference on atmospheric electricity, and some other ones that are on a little bit longer timescales. I try to go to those whenever I can. My job, I have my hand in a couple of different pots as far as like research goes, like tropical meteorology, that sort of stuff. So it just kind of depends on the year.
Right.
And honestly, like where's the conference, right? Like the International Conference on Atmospheric Electricity, like it's been in Rio and Nara, Japan, and Tel Aviv, you know, like it's,
Wow.
That's pretty cool. Anything from you, Quinton, before we head out?
I don't think so.
Well, guys, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for bringing me on. You know, you guys know I always love chatting about meteorology and you know, instrumentation and that sort of thing. There's plenty of stuff to talk about, and I'm sure like with the new Twisters movie coming out, there's going to be so much hype associated with that, and you know, a lot of good conversations are going to come out of that. So.
For sure.
Oh, I got a really important question. So Vortex 2 era, what kind of data loggers were you using?
Back then, we were using the CR1000Xs.
Okay.
That was kind of the top of the line-ish. At that point, they were working on some newer things, but that one fit our needs as far as like, you know, the number of available ports and serial ports and that sort of thing. Since then, as you know, we've converted over to the CR6 loggers, which are really expensive, but have a lot of flexibility. Like you can do a lot of different things with them. And more importantly, they have a lot of processing power. Mm-hmm. So one of the big changes that I've done since the Vortex 2 era is the logger is now doing a lot more of like the heavy lifting on calculations that our LabVIEW program that we have was doing before. So now I've got the logger doing a lot of that.
Nice. Yeah, I have one running at my house and it's amazing. You know, it's awesome. So, but I've run out of,
this man just is.
But I've run out of ports to put 5 different anemometers. I can't do that apparently. So
he ran out of pulse channels.
Yeah, I need like 100 pulse channels.
You can start getting those like expansion ports that like, you know, double your pulse channel count and things like that. Just crazy between like 8 of those things together.
Yeah, wind sensors are like my niche. So that's all I care about. Wind readings. It's fine. But we'll let you go. I know you got a busy life, so we really appreciate it. Definitely we'll have you on next time.
Pleasure, truly.
This will be a great episode release, so looking forward to putting it out there for everyone to hear. So
awesome. Well, thanks guys. Thanks for inviting me along.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. You too, guys.
All right.
Peace.
Bye.
Bye.